a new compare.
Our next speaker, Professor Manning, needs no introductions. I can tell you exactly when he arrived in Cyprus, because I met him on the first day he arrived. And on the first day at Maroni Vournes excavations, he found a piece of pithos with a Cyprominoan inscription. I was jealous of him immediately, but he's too nice to be mad at him, so we have been friends ever since. This is his brainchild, this event, but I'm very happy that we're sharing the organization now. Thank you very much. We're not sharing the cost, so this is all on him. With a few exceptions, the reception is on us. Thank you very much, Sturt, for bringing this event to the Archaeological Research Unit. And let us know if you need a minute before the time starts for your personal...
Okay, let's... Okay, part of my time. Well, there we go. Well, I decided not to just do the obvious, which was talk about Moroni or talk about Cyprus or talk about trade or maybe thoughts on where perhaps Knapp is not perfect or is imperfect but could be improved. I thought I'd actually talk about climate, which is going to be one of my next projects I'm working on, but it also partly reflects a long-term scholarly trajectory for me and life's history. It started off with my first major publication, which was also in Bernard's first issue of Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, so it's fair to say I feel I owe a great deal to Bernard in terms of how I've started in the career. I suspect I might not have actually even got into Cypriot archaeology if Bernard had not made it sound so sexy and terrific when we met in Australia and talked about it. Might have picked somewhere else to go. Might have made a mistake and gone to Pella and Jordan, for example. And then I did get much more interested in this whole area. And then Bernard proposed the paper that's on the top right that we took a little while to write. At about the time, we got particularly interested in issues of climate and archaeology. And it is fair to say, in some senses, this current project stems out of the fact that I started working on that. So thank you so much, Bernard, for everything you've done. Okay. We've got fairly used in trendy archaeology to thing theory of late and material agency, and we've even had a bit of discussion about this in talks today. But perhaps a more worrying, I think, and alarming trend has been the sort of climate agency tendency in the last couple of years, in which leading scholars like Michael McCormack, Kyle Harper and others are more or less writing history, for example, of the end of the Roman world on the basis that climate did it, as if climate is an independent actor, and it rather takes out the role of humans in the whole process. So it may seem ironic, given I'm meant to be one of these people who's interested in climate and archaeology, I'm going to suggest that we've been looking at this a little bit the wrong way round. So you can find any number of websites, articles and pictures that have this type of thing in which wild swings in climate are meant to have led to the collapse, fall or end of things like the Roman Empire. I'll just note again, Romans, I'm talking about Romans. But the first question is to ask, well, what actually is the fall of the Roman Empire? Can you actually define this? And although you'll find some books from the old and staid through to the only last year and hopefully prize-winning type of efforts that aiming at the popular media, no one really defines what the fall of the Roman Empire is. And as an immediate observation to make, the so-called end of the Roman Empire in the West is not paralleled by an end of anything in the East, and by the time the Eastern Empire seems to go into something of a decline, actually the Western Mediterranean is having very much a high point. So we have very regional and different trajectories, and this idea of unilinear models in which any one thing explains any other one thing invariably does not work in archaeology if you investigate carefully. However, as is often the case with fields, the first generation of scholarship in some topic brings the new idea, the new simplicity, and then we have to complicate it. Now, in the current age, we're all very concerned with climate, and particularly things like the Anthropocene and extinctions, and you'll have all seen David Attenborough type programs with pictures like this, which I've stolen one of his at the bottom there, for example. And if we're going to have an Anthropocene, even when it starts, the amusing one is actually it's the Great Rise in Chicken Bones, which reflects the sort of McDonald's Kentucky Fried Chicken age, as opposed to the more sensible ideas of radioactive signals or plastic in the deep ocean, etc., etc., etc. But we have to start to ask questions. So, How is climate meant to act to cause history? The normal thing is to get one of these unintelligible diagrams, and I think it was Michael who made some comment about multi-plotty things. They're often referred to as spaghetti diagrams in the field, which I think they hadn't read Hodder when they said that. What you tend to get is some sort of proxy up the top, in this case temperature, which has come from elaborate statistical analysis of all sorts of things, which you need a PhD to usually actually get to that point. And then at the bottom, you plot a whole bunch of things. And apparently this Bunken et al., and Ulf Bunken is one of the absolute leaders in this field, both technically and also in terms of just sheer productivity. It's a mystery to me how he actually writes quite so much. Nonetheless, and if you look along the bottom, this is the takeaway, that's a 200-year period. So we're in 2019, 1819, Napoleon's just been sent off to exile a couple of years ago, and if we were talking about that period to now, we wouldn't think there was any form of connection between those times. World War I is roughly in the middle of that time, and again, although we regard it as a historically important event, we don't see a connection, an immediate connection. And yet, the so-called late antique little ice age that Bunken created effectively in his 2016 publication, it's meant to explain an end, and yet, as you can see from the diagram he's published, there's no end involved here. There's a 200-year period. We also have the question of what exactly do we really think we're doing, and the role of the human and the anthropogenic in this. Now, this is a well-known painting in which we're looking at a frost fair with London Bridge in the distance. We'll come back to it, but this is the type of thing you're thinking about when people talk about the Little Ice Age. This is perhaps one of the most famous pictures of the Little Ice Age. It's on the front cover of a book by a German scholar about climate and history. And it's obviously cold, and it's miserable, and the world must have been a pretty depressing place in the Little Ice Age. It's extraordinary to think humanity came through it. This painting is by the same artist, supposedly about the same year. It's one of a set that shows the months and activities that Bruegel did. For archaeologists, this is an even more famous painting, because this is the one that Tim Ingold used in that 1993 study in World Archaeology, which I read again actually the other day, deciding maybe I never fully understood it the first time, and I look forward to somebody still enlightening me fully. That's not the point of it. Do read the little bit of text in yellow that Ingold supplied with the painting when he put it in World Archaeology. Any landowner would have cause for satisfaction in such a fine crop. Bruegel painted during a period of great material prosperity in the Netherlands. These were fortunate times. This is the high point of the Little Ice Age. I won't, to keep interest of time, put it up, but of course Bunken has a diagram that shows the Little Ice Age as a big dip. These big dips are disasters and cause the end of civilization. This does not look like the end of civilization. So it highlights the fact that in many areas of the world, even though you may have climate proxies telling you that something is going up or down, that's not necessarily relevant. It may be very relevant if you're in a highly marginal or susceptible location. If you are living on the edge of a desert and it gets a little bit drier, it's now too dry, and you're in trouble. If, however, you're living in a relatively normal, complacent location where you get regular rains and so on, you may get slightly less, or you might get slightly more, but you actually are not thrown completely out of the loop. It's just going to look like a little bit of a blip. Now, if you go back to that famous painting, which proved that the Thames froze over and the Little Ice Age was really terrible, it must have been incredibly cold, a really important paper by Mike Lockwood got published a couple of years ago, in which he made a really important observation, which is that if you look to see when the Thames froze, it froze while London Bridge existed. This greatly constricted the water flow, and because the water was much more slowly moving, it could freeze. Since London Bridge has not been there, it basically has never frozen. So the frost fairs are an anthropogenic artifact. If we had not built the bridge, and if we had not let the river flow out, they built big embankments after they took the bridge down, you would not have a frozen Thames. So although clearly the fact it was a little bit colder in the Little Ice Age would have helped, it's not the cause of the Thames frost fairs and the Thames freezing over. Humans were. This study, fresh out, is even more alarmist for those who are climate historians, or at least of the sort of type that I put in my first few book covers and one come up from Harvey Weiss. This is a study, detailed study of tree rings and climate and particularly precipitation and temperature, but we're looking at temperature here, from the Altai Mountains. And if you look across the bottom scale, 1400, 500 years, you'll see that where it's got little blips up, which represent major volcanic eruptions, you'll see little variation. Bars show major solar changes, a little bit of a variation. The overall net trend is a straight line. This runs entirely contrary a great deal of work in climate science, which has been pretty determinedly finding a cold period in the first half of this diagram. How can this be happening? Well, it's not just a case that I've kind of gone over to the dark side and I'm hiding my mega cap in the back or something like this. It reflects the type of statistical analysis you do and what you're expecting to find. And as we all know, you find what you look for. And if you're looking for a trend that involves a hockey stick, you find one. And if you're not, obviously you cannot. This is a fairly neutral study. It's attempting to actually look for shorter-term trends. That's why it's finding the volcanoes and the solar influence. But if you do that, you actually discover that the real long-term background is more or less a straight line. And I think if we assume this withstands a bit of critical scrutiny, I've only had a few hours when I went through it, it seemed okay. But if this withstands scrutiny, this is going to start to be, I think, a bit of the straw that breaks the sort of camel's back situation. Nonetheless, archaeology and all such sort of fields is always half a generation behind the sort of leading science in an area like this. So the new book, of course, in the field, out by Harvey Weiss, suggests, of course, that mega droughts basically drive history. And if you've read the book, from the Holocene through to the recent period, there are a series of these mega droughts, and they are described as, very historically forcing and important. We have a view here over part of southern Jordan. It obviously looks pretty desperately dry and inhospitable, but of course, this is only a couple of kilometers from Petra, and this is where, for a long period of time, we have a major civilization, the Nabataeans, who adapted to this environment and worked around it. Now, arguably, maybe the decline in the Nabataeans was linked to the somewhat poorer conditions that happened in the late antique period, but it probably had much more to do with shifting trade routes and geopolitical issues than it did about the fact that it got any drier. It was already very dry. The point was humans could adapt to that if other factors made it worth their while. Now, what do we need to sort of go forward? I think we need to rethink the question about what we're actually looking for, and we also need much better information in most cases. This wonderful quote from the other Donald sums it up. We really need to know what we don't know. Now, of course, that's a logical paradox, because we don't know what we don't know, which is what he's telling us. But at the present moment, our total information about past climate is remarkably limited. And of course, Michael put a diagram up. Our past knowledge about past climate related to past archaeology, putting the two together, is getting fairly close to not very much at all. But we do know some things, because if we work in this part of the world, we have classical authors and other texts, and particularly Ugaritic. I love the Ugaritic text. And we can find out one very important lesson, thanks to many scholars, particularly people like Paul Halstead, who've worked on this, which is how farming works in the Mediterranean zone. And in particular, everybody who's worked on this, either commenting on ancient authors, looking at what ethnographic farmers in the present do, reading medieval texts and studying how city economies and politics work, they all observe that any sensible farmer or city or magistrate look to try and have a store of supplies, so basic foodstuffs, to see them through approximately one bad year. And they all comment, like the Raphael quote here, that at 2 consecutive bad years really was a major spanner in the works. This is when things went badly wrong. And you have accounts of starvation, you have accounts of things going bad, riots, you have accounts of people dying, and it becomes a tragedy. So that's what we really need to think about, is if you're looking at bad things, that type of human crisis level. It's not that somebody could not have aimed to have stored for 2 bad years in a row, they just didn't. And we'll come to why they didn't, because of course 2 bad years in a row does not happen very often. And humans, while being economic animals, are short-term economic animals. The usual argument. If I tell you the roof here will collapse, but it's unlikely to collapse more than once in the next 100 years, we'll all sit here. If I were to seriously say it's going to collapse, and it's quite likely to collapse at least once in the next 12 months, I think we'd all start thinking maybe it would be better to stand in the street and continue this discussion, because that would seem just a bit too much on the risk factor. The other huge challenge for humans in the pre-electrical, pre-modern trucks, ships, etc. age, which I guess will be a new challenge again in the sort of post-carbon era that we're starting to enter, is storage and transport is not that easy. And particularly with things like grain, which we regard as one of the staples, it's fabulous because you collect it, you thresh it, you process it. It's sort of like, solid. You can put it in jars or containers, you can move it somewhere, but you can't actually keep it for more than a relatively short period of time. It goes off. You can, of course, bury it in pits in the ground, like in southern France, and the moment you open it, it goes off. So you can have some strategies to try and have a bit of a store, but it's a big issue. And in particular, as you know from the Roman world, when you study that, you have to try and move the produce from the farm and processing to the market as quickly as possible. And there is no long lag time here. There are no apples being kept in these sort of like cold conditions, like in modern day Western civilization, where the apple you eat in March was picked last August and things, and it's a bit frightening really to contemplate. It's just sort of been sitting there somewhere waiting for you. Now, back to the issue of, well, how often do you have a famine, therefore? Well, Peter Garnsey, I think, deserves credit as the scholar who started this type of work and this well-known and important book. He looked at some agricultural statistics that were then available from Greece, from Athens. He looked at Thessaloniki, a couple of areas, and he calculated how often you had one bad year, which, for example, in Attica was quite often, but how often did you have 2 bad years in a row? And the answer is not very often. And you can see the statistics across the bottom there. I just put the Van Gogh in there just to sort of show the idea of peasants not having a good time. Well, what about this part of the world? And maybe what about where we have data that goes further than Peter had access to when he was doing the work in the 1980s? Because that was utter pioneer territory. Nobody was doing climate history and things at that time, apart from a man called Hubert Lamb, who is a genuine pioneer. So if we look in our part of the world, you're getting rainfall and things up on the top, which will show you that anything that's fairly red or brown means pretty desperately dry, and anything that's moving into green or blue, they've got some water. So we see major regional differences, very important points. So everywhere is not the same. In fact, even places quite close to each other are not the same. And on the other side, you'll see diagrams with little boxes or a bar indicating the 300 to 200 millimeter of rain level in a given year. 300 millimeters of rain is always cited, including by Garnsey, citing a French study back to the beginning of the 20th century. It's probably one of these sort of factoids that almost needs to actually be re-established. But 300 millimeters is thought to be about the minimum you get a viable wheat harvest. That doesn't necessarily mean it just dies in front of you. It means it will be like 9 inches high and there's basically no real useful food to be acquired there. And 200 millimeters is when even barley, which is much more drought resistant, starts to drop off the picture, according to Tony Wilkinson, who remains the sort of one major anthropological scholar who's studied this topic in detail. And what you'll see if you look across, although the data that we get from northern Syria in the top and from a couple of different places in Cyprus in the bottom, several of them cross into that danger zone or below it a number of times, but actually very rarely do they do it 2 years in a row. So, how often does it happen where we have even longer data? So, in a study published last year, looked at a couple of tree ring records that we have from 2 parts of Anatolia and the Aegean, so basically have North Aegean parts of Greece, therefore, and the South Aegean. Same type of model in which you're seeing model rainfall up and down. The light grey is the 1 standard deviation variation, dark grey is 2 standard deviations, so arbitrary measure. If it's outside of the 95% norm, and particularly at the bottom, which means very little rainfall, it's going to be pretty unusually dry, meaning dramatically so. Just for those who are living here, this winter would count as 2 sigma in the opposite direction, as a for instance. Whereas last year would have been close to 2 sigma downwards because it was incredibly dry in Cyprus, for example. So, where you see the stars, that's marking the ones where it's more than 2 standard deviations below. And you should immediately notice the stars are not next to each other. Very rare to see them even close to each other. And you can spot whole periods of decades, even a century, where there are no stars. And this is the more recent period. Now, if you collate that together, Only twice in almost a millennium do you get 2 consecutive years in Anatolia where you have very low rainfall. One is in the early 20th century under Ataturk, doesn't really count. Trucks, telegraph, modern communication was available in a modern unified state, so doesn't really count. Although if you look at the economic statistics, it was a huge hit on gross domestic product and was a major economic and political event. But the other one, 1607-8 up there, and in fact, the light grey means it's almost bad. There's 4 or 5 years here in a row which are really, really bad. And oddly enough, this is when the Jalali Rebellion happened, and which nearly brought the Ottoman Empire down. It's the only major, huge, peasant, organized, led, involved, depending how you look at it, rebellion that occurred. And Sam White, in this book on the climate of rebellion, spotted this and went with the fact that it did seem that climate was one of the driving factors here that caused this. So, probably yes. But I would say the real takeaway is, in almost the millennium, once. So that's really important, but it's also rather important to say that most of the other 900 odd years here, climate was not such a dramatic forcing event. Instead, climate is the context within which human actors have opportunities or problems and challenges that they're going to have to address or ignore at their peril. So, what's the other thing that nobody talks about seemingly in any of these climate studies? Although you can draw grey bars, like this one here, does the pointer work? Oh. And this is the collapse of the Roman Empire according to a 2011 study by up the top, no, it isn't that one, it's the Bunkton et al. Sorry, ignore those two. But the period of the high point of the Roman Empire, the notable feature is how little noise and variation there is in the diagram. So periods of relative stability in which there are not dramatic switches or changes in climate are perhaps very important and provide opportunities for major empires and states to build more successful economic models because they're not being undermined or having to change direction, or leaders having to think of alternative solutions because of a new problem that's come along. Rather, the existing solution can work rather well, and there's the ability to bank capital and basically to become rich and happy. And we saw about the busy Roman countryside. And then maybe you hit a period of challenge. But people don't talk about opportunities. That's another aspect of climate and archaeology which seems to be ignored. And yet it's going to be highly relevant to Cyprus because some aspects of the Cypriot economy and environment are relatively marginal, therefore slightly better circumstances over a prolonged period are going to be very important, whereas a prolonged period of negative circumstances might also be more challenging in some locations. Okay, and then a key issue to come over here is that such climate changes play out regionally. So here is a map showing from a drought monitoring service showing our part of the world over a period of a little period in which it's mapping how many people down the bottom are suffering from drought, which is terrible, and where you get dark colors it's really bad. And what you'll observe, of course, is that this part of the world was pretty much in drought at the time this study was being done. And yet you'll notice that other large parts of Europe and the Mediterranean are not. And Neil Roberts et al. In a really important 2012 paper, which everybody in this room should probably read, did a study of 900 years looking at lake levels between Iberia and Anatolia, in which he identified that there seemed to be a consistent seesaw effect between the East and the West Mediterranean. In really simple terms, if it's very dry in Iberia and having a drought, it's good times in central Turkey. If it's really dry and bad times in central Turkey, like 1607, it's good times in Iberia. Let's see that played out from the Old World Drought Atlas. Here we are in 1921. T.S. Eliot's desperately writing The Wasteland, and it's the 100 Days of Drought in England, up here. Doesn't look very drought-like down here. In fact, it's quite good conditions. But alternatively, when we go back to 1607, huge and desperate drought in Anatolian parts of the Aegean. Look at this. It's actually like raining. It's basically prime conditions in Iberia. So when we're talking about something like the fall of the Roman Empire, which spans this entire region, it's just simply impossible. Part of this empire is actually having a good time at the very time some other parts are having a bad time. And if you think, what's the problem? shipping between areas and so on. It's going to come down to politics, humans, and other forms of interest groups as to whether this becomes a problem or a disaster, not strictly just the environment. A couple of pictures just to try and highlight this. So T.S. Eliot writing his poem, but of course elsewhere in Europe this turned into one of the great humanitarian disasters of the 20th century, because in a country like e.g. then Soviet Union, under Stalin, a dictatorship, not a great deal of interest in the population, millions of people died. Millions of people did not die in the UK in the 100-day drought in 1921. So a huge amount comes down to the nature of the political system, and although everybody quotes it, and it's sort of not really entirely perfect, but Amartya Sen's statement that you don't have people dying of drought in democracies more or less plays out. And very often it's a human-caused problem. So the centralized model under Stalin was most certainly the problem, but we also know when it comes to the Dust Bowl that happened after the Great Depression in the US, it was largely to do with human problems. People were farming areas that were never going to be viable. It wasn't something that was necessarily a great act of God, it was the fact that mistakes were being made on where people were farming, types of economies they were trying to pursue. Okay, now the other thing we need is better and more precise information. This chart shows with the date that we have proper climate records for the Mediterranean. Anything that's in red or brown, it goes back for several hundred years. Anything that's blue is less than 100 years. You'll notice that almost everything's in blue. So we know very little. But don't we have historical records? Well, this is a compendium we put together in the 2012 paper that I was part of, showing records. Well, yes, we do, but you'll notice that there's huge numbers from one particular archive, and then we have whole centuries, we have almost nothing. So it's a completely subjective and pretty much useless record. It's cute to be able to quote something from it, but it doesn't give you any form of climate record. Can we do better? Well, obviously, things like trees are wonderful, because you can get annual records from them. This paper that my lab, so various collaborators in my lab, including Brita, who's sitting at the back there, we worked on, were able to reconstruct tree ring records against modern-day climate to give us a proxy, and then we can then extrapolate precipitation back for the length of the tree ring record, and we can plot the years that seem to be particularly dry. Yes, there are some, but you'll notice they don't happen all the time, and in fact there's typically decades between each of these episodes. Those are the bad years. So when we cut to something like Harvey Weiss and the 4.2 event, and various records show that this event definitely seems to exist. And you can do clever Bayesian modeling and come up with dates for the end of his own site, Tel Leyland, and get awfully close to 2200 BC. And here in Cyprus, if you look at the results from Margee, it does seem that there's something going on around about 2200 in which there's a before and there's an after. But really, as Wasink pointed out in the book, it's a question of exactly what type of economy you're trying to pursue and exactly where you're trying to pursue it, is to whether this 4.2 event is particularly significant. And Tel Leyland is up here in a particularly marginal location. It was very susceptible to changes in rainfall. A number of the other named sites on this map happily carry on right through this event and have no problem whatsoever. So you easily get the impression that the world ends, and Harvey likes to write about that type of thing, but it doesn't. Of course, there's another world-ending event in any year other than 1177. And Bernard and I put this one in that paper we did, in which people, and he's not here to be offended, Kanievsky, they do a high-resolution climate study based on 3 radiocarbon dates. I mean, this isn't even like an evidential basis that's worth commenting on. They claim that they have dates. We then remodeled the dates to come up with how precise they were and discover that actually they could date anywhere within hundreds of years. So, this wasn't exactly precise information. And you get a whole variety of these little spaghetti diagrams where typically, shown by the arrows, you have to, the phrase in climate literature is tune them, i.e. move them around to make them seem to work together. Now, by definition, that suggests that you don't have a stable timescale, and if we're archaeologists, we'd hopefully say, well, we don't believe that goes together if you have to move them around to make them go together. There is hope. If you look at the Gordian tree ring record, for example, for Central Anatolia, there is a really interesting period here where there's a whole 2-decade period where a number of years are unusually dry. So it's possible to find some interesting events which maybe help explain some context behind this. But again, it's important to remember the Sea Peoples phenomenon. It's not a one-year phenomenon. It takes place over decades. So it's about politics, economy, many forms of human decision-making, not just one climate event. So, studies of the collapse of societies usually find no single climate prime mover, whether a complex set of different issues, which may include climate, and I'll call out Butzer here, who has made this point repeatedly and is ignored repeatedly. And really, even where we do have a climate drive, we often see forms of human resilience versus collapse, except sometimes in marginal loci, like Tel Leyland. Last slide. So, most work is also published, that's been published, has only looked at climate as a threat, and I suggest that that's really missing half of the point at least. Many times there's an opportunity involved. So, at this point, we need much more work linking climate history and at a regional level with archaeological and historical processes. Cyprus is an unusually good place to do this, which is why I think it's a good place to do this talk and include a volume like this, because Bernard has brought years and years of attention to the need to look at the political economy and to consider how things change, and even with his book on the annals, to look at long-term change. But if we're going to do this, we actually need some high-quality data at a location where we have lots of rich archaeology, and it's in a place which is climatically sensitive. It is no point doing this somewhere in the middle of southern England. It doesn't matter what happens year by year. It's okay. It's not okay in Cyprus all the time. Therefore, this is actually a place to consider trying to look at this complicated relationship between humans, history, archaeology, and climate. Thank you. Okay. Well, I know I'm over. Okay, but one question. Would anybody like to ask one question? Or comment. Is that a hand being waved?
There's somebody from the other room, yes.
Oh, go for it.
Okay. This is just to kind of add something to what you mentioned about Sam White's idea and suggestion about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Very recently, Kolovos and Kojagiorgis gave a very nice presentation where they compared what he was presenting to developments in the Balkans, and they totally kind of put serious dents on the theory that that's much more of a local, so the ice age even in the South Balkans is not really a thing. So it really serves what you mentioned. Thank you.
Incredibly strong in central Anatolia and parts of Greece, and it literally drifted out by the time it got to Albania or anywhere further north. So exactly, it's a big region, but it's highly regional. It's not macro. Okay, I should stop. We're late. Our next speaker needs almost no introduction. A very distinguished Aegean prehistorian, although now works in the Caribbean. And somebody that has been involved with Bernard from early in his career, and critically has been editing JMA with Bernard and now with Peter van Dommelen for many decades, and has been a signal voice in Mediterranean prehistory and especially in Mediterranean survey amongst other topics, but also the 1994 book on provenience that they did together. So a scholar who's had a huge impact on all aspects of Mediterranean archaeology. So I'd welcome John Cherry to speak about 30 years before the mast at the helm of JMA with Bernard Knapp.
So, as they say on Monty Python, now for something completely different. And I need to begin with a small explanation. Professor A. Bernard Knapp is one of those scholars who are saddled with a growing up name that they outgrew. At the time I first got to know him, everyone knew him as Bernie. And he's been so referred to a couple of times today by accident. But once he achieved some academic stability and status with a real job, he decided that he should no longer be called by his childhood name, but by his given name, Bernard. Other friends of mine in Mediterranean prehistory have gone down this same path. Dan Pullen, for instance, suddenly became Daniel Pullen overnight. My undergraduate classmate, Penny Mountjoy, as I knew her then, suddenly became Penelope Ann Mountjoy and refused to speak to me if I didn't address her that way. Okay, so fair enough. But to my English ears, Bernard sounds all wrong. The American pronunciation, almost unsayable. Perhaps this is because one of my earliest memories is of my teetotal grandmother reading me a picture book about how St. Bernard dogs, note the pronunciation, go to the rescue of stranded alpine travelers with around their necks a barrel, not of brandy, but as she would have it, hot milk. So since Bernard sounds so wrong to me, some years ago, a number of us compromised by referring to him as Bernardo, if not just ABK. So in my remarks today, Bernardo it is. Well, I'm delighted to be here today for several reasons. One, of course, is that it gives me the opportunity to salute and honor Bernardo, my close friend and colleague over 4 decades now. And this is, in a sense, payback time, because he took the time and trouble 3 years ago to travel all the way from Cyprus to Providence, Rhode Island, for a conference in my own honor, and then to contribute an excellent paper to the Festschrift volume that followed, as a volume of the monographs in Mediterranean Archaeology series, which he himself founded. And lastly, I'll just say that while Ithaca, New York is a lovely place, and I was sorry, of course, that illness forced the postponement of the event planned to happen at Cornell last year, I think it's fitting that we are gathered here on Bernardo's adopted home turf for the last decade, and of course the main focus of his entire academic career. And so I should also echo other previous thanks Dirk warmly for all the work that went into organizing the aborted Cornell conference, and then again with his new co-organizers here in Nicosia. Now, when he was thinking about trying to get together some kind of event such as this, Sturt naturally turned for advice to Peter van Dommelen and myself, Bernardo's longtime collaborators as editors of the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, and in Peter's case, a former fellow faculty member in the Department of Archaeology at Glasgow University. And we quickly agreed in our initial conversations that an honorary conference such as this should, of course, be centered around the Cypriot archaeology that has dominated Bernardo's career. Fine. But this left myself and Peter high and dry because neither of us works on the archaeology of Cyprus. And so we had agreed for Cornell to offer just a few concluding remarks. Well, now here we are in Nicosia, and Peter can't be with us because of his Sardinian fieldwork obligations, so I have to go it alone. But actually this opens the door for me to talk about a very significant aspect of Bernardo's career that we would be remiss not to acknowledge and honor today. Everybody in the room is aware of his contributions to Cypriot pre- and proto-history over the past 40 years. Exactly 40 years since his Berkeley PhD. Countless articles, chapters, reviews, many books, including the 2 monographs on Cypriot pre- and proto-history, the one for Oxford and the one for Cambridge that you see here, that have authoritatively defined the field for the current age. Bernardo, I would say, has also been astute in spotting developing topics and capturing them in influential and influential edited and co-authored volumes, some of which you see here, not all of them. The Annal perspective in archaeology, the archaeology of landscape, the social archaeology of mining communities, mobility, materiality, identity, Mediterranean connections, and so on. Not forgetting, of course, that huge Cambridge prehistory of the Bronze and Iron Age Mediterranean that he co-edited with Peter van Dommelen in 2014. But today, what I'd like to draw attention to is something perhaps less splashy, but which has been going on in the background for the past 31 years, and which I suggest is, in fact, amongst Bernardo's most important contributions to archaeology. I refer, of course, to the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, which he founded, the first issue of which appeared in June 1988, and of which he has been an editor or a co-editor ever since. And that ever since is itself a remarkable achievement. The journal Antiquity that you see at the top there was at one time notable for having been edited during its first 6 decades by just 2 gentlemen, O.G.S. Crawford and Glyn Daniel. But now Bernardo, along with John Humphrey, at the Journal of Roman Archaeology, founded in the self-same year, has surpassed even Crawford and Daniel's records. And I imagine, I haven't checked this out, but I think that they must by now be the longest serving journal editors in archaeology. Having myself, as you see at the bottom of the slide, served as a co-editor of JMA since 1990, I want to offer a few thoughts on the journal's creation, history, guiding principles, and impact. Bernardo will probably dispute most of this, as is his wont. So looking back to the beginning, Bernardo's decision to try to establish an ambitious new journal was an act of bravado, and its success was far from guaranteed. For one thing, at that time, he had no permanent academic position. That came only in the mid-1990s at the University of Glasgow, when he was already in his 50s. And for the previous dozen years, he had held a variety of fellowships and research assistantships in Sydney, in Nicosia, and in Cambridge. For another thing, the publisher he persuaded to produce and distribute JMA was a very unlikely one, Sheffield Academic Press, a small academic imprint attached to the Department of Biblical Studies at Sheffield University, itself launched only in the mid-1980s and focused on publications in religious studies, not in archaeology. Their business model was, to be honest, a bit amateur, and at their outset, their ability to publish, market, and distribute a journal in a field entirely new to them was far from proven. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, JMA's design in those early years, you see it on the screen, was modest, a limit of 128 pages per issue, and a small 6 by 8 inch page format, making it feel, I almost felt, almost like a slim book of poetry that one could slip into one's pocket to read on the train. This lasted only half a dozen years until the press was bought out by Continuum, a far larger publishing group, which owned and produced JMA for the next 9 years. This was not always a happy relationship, to be frank, and we were relieved when, in 2003, Janet Joyce, who had been a senior editor at Continuum, left that company to form her own publishing house, Equinox, taking JMA with her, giving it an attractive new design, and in 2012, for the journal's 25th anniversary, moving to unlimited full-color illustration. Now, if JMA is both stable and successful now, this could not have been predicted at the outset. Not all journals make it. The data presented in a recent 2016 article in a journal I read all the time, Scientometrics, on recent trends in academic journal growth illustrates not only what we already know, that is the relentless, almost exponential pace at which new journals are coming into existence all the time. The number grows by 3.5% each year, but also their failure rates. For example, to take 1988, the year in which JMA was created, a total of 489 new journals in all fields started publishing. But if we roll the clock forward to 215, the most recent data for this article, 61 of these journals had become inactive. For another thing, there was increasing competition. This Google Ngram, I'm very fond of these, it's a plot of the incidence of the phrase Mediterranean archaeology in publications of actually the past century and a half. And it indicates a sharp uptick, in fact exponential growth, from almost exactly the point that JMA was founded. And it would be lovely to kid ourselves that this was all JMA's doing, but the reality is that increasing numbers of scholars, not only in archaeology, but also well beyond it, were at this time finding the Mediterranean as a whole a useful framework, heuristic framework for their work. And this is reflected in the active growth of journals and monograph series to serve those interests. This is something that was explored some years ago by Sue Alcock in a chapter in William Harris's book, Rethinking the Mediterranean, an article amusingly entitled Alphabet Soup in the Mediterranean Basin, the Emergence of the Mediterranean Cereal. And I will not go into the details of her analysis here and now, but this slide, I think, that lists the journals and cereals she analyzed gets the point across. Whereas there were very few such Mediterranean publications prior to the 1980s, and several, shown here in blue towards the top, had already failed, there was marked growth from that time on. Alcock's study ended in 2005, but further Mediterranean journals, including archaeological Mediterranean journals, have come online since, and I list just a few of them at the foot of the slide. But the bottom line is that JMA was launched into an increasingly competitive publishing environment. But there was even competition alarmingly close to home. For 3 years in the mid-1980s, Bernardo held a research fellowship in the Department of Archaeology at Sydney University. And in 1987, while he was formulating plans to get JMA off the ground, he learned that certain other members of the department at Sydney also had plans to launch a journal to be called Mediterranean Archaeology. And after some initial consternation and worries about whether the field could actually sustain 2 new journals in Mediterranean archaeology, the problem resolved itself. Because it turned out that the full title of that journal, that other journal, was to be the Australian and New Zealand Journal for Mediterranean Archaeology. And launched in 1988, just like JMA, it has, and it's still going, it has developed mainly as a medium through which archaeologists in Australasia report on their research and fieldwork in the Mediterranean region and publish on Mediterranean materials held in Australian collections. In other words, completely different from JMA's remit. So let me turn now briefly to the intellectual context of JMA's launch. In its early days, Bernardo and I must have had many conversations around the topic of why JMA. And indeed, in those very earliest years, from 1989 to 1991, I saw Bernardo daily because he was an archaeological research assistant to the University of Cambridge section, led by Colin Renfrew and myself, of the major British Academy project, Bronze Age Trade in the Aegean and adjacent areas. A position that led to our co-authorship of the monograph already mentioned, Provenance Studies and Bronze Age Cyprus, Production, Exchange, and Politico-Economic Change, which, by the way, is my only contribution to Cyprus archaeology. Let me make that very clear. Nonetheless, I don't now recall our conversations about JMA, other than that it seemed at the time the right thing, an exciting thing to try to do. So the 1970s and 1980s were, as you all know, turbulent times in archaeology, which, if I might speak personally for just a moment, I witnessed at first hand. I was a student of Lewis Binford in the early 1970s, and then moved on to become Colin Renfrew's doctoral student a bit later in the decade. And at the decade's end, both Colin and I were appointed to the University of Cambridge, and so I became not only Colin's colleague, but also Ian Hodder's. And so I was an eyewitness to both the fervor of the new archaeology in the United States and also the beginnings of the post-processual critique in the UK in the early 1980s. And yet, while exciting things were happening in archaeology on the wider stage, I have to say that the rhetorical scene in much of Europe, and certainly almost all of the Mediterranean, was remarkably quiet. In fact, it was because all the conferences taking place in the UK at that time were so data-driven and so stupendously boring that Colin Renfrew and a number of others of us founded the Theoretical Archaeology Group meetings at about this time. And it was several years, it was just several years before JMA was founded that Renfrew, again, had delivered two seminal plenary papers, one to the Archaeological Institute of America and one to the Society for American Archaeology, called The Great Tradition versus the Great Divide and Divided We Stand. These are two very famous papers in the field, in which he argued the need for a rapprochement between the rich data and the long scholarly traditions of archaeology in the Mediterranean and the Near East, on the one hand, with the problem orientation and theoretical strengths of current anthropological theory. And Anthony Snodgrass in 1985 wrote along very similar lines in his paper called The New Archaeology and the Classical Archaeologist. In fact, Bernardo directly referenced both of these Renfrew papers at length in his inaugural editorial statement. And again, just a couple of years later, in another editorial, he pledged that JMA would, and I'm quoting here, continue to bridge the gap between the great tradition and the great divide, between history and social sciences, between processual and post-processual archaeology. Yet another seismic event, I would say, the year before JMA came into being, was the 1986 Southampton UISPP conference fiasco that led to the creation of WAC, the World Archaeology Conference, that I would argue has changed the focus of archaeology around the globe. So these are perhaps just some straws in the wind, but I think they speak to the context of JMA's launch by Bernardo in 1988. There was pressure, to quote Renfrew's words, pressure for a fresh and lively sense of problem, an ability to generalize systematically and coherently, recognition that our task was to explain as well as to reconstruct, a focus on the processes of long-term change. In short, JMA was founded on a platform that provided equal opportunity both for locally specific data and Mediterranean-wide contextual, suitably theorized comparison. And this has been the journal's mandate since its earliest days, and I would say that Bernardo has carried that out magnificently. Jeremy has always adhered to two key criteria of acceptability, posted prominently on the journal's website for all wannabe authors to see. You see them on the screen. Boiled down to their essentials, they are, one, the need to meld data with a theoretical context for interpretation, and two, the necessity of setting one's own locally situated study within the broader comparative framework of Mediterranean archaeology. Notwithstanding these, to us at least, clear-cut criteria, we nevertheless receive many papers that fail to meet them for numerous reasons. JMA doesn't publish short notes. JMA doesn't publish fieldwork reports or interim reports or purely theoretical papers or book reviews. It focuses on long and thoughtful papers of about 10,000 words. And to give you a sense of what that is, that's about twice the length of a typical World Archaeology article. And while many submitted manuscripts are not necessarily unpublishable papers, they're just not publishable in JMA because they fail to meet those criteria. So we actually have a 2/3 rejection rate, which is pretty high as archaeological journals go. So Bernardo has been adamant about the application of these criteria, even when his co-editors have shown signs of wilting under the pressure of the need to fill the next issue. This has been one of his signal contributions, I would say, to the vitality and strength of the journal over many years. In other words, he's never let his standards drop. The early years, though, were tough in terms of filling the journal with papers that reflected its pan-Mediterranean comparative aspirations. This was perhaps in the early days a consequence of our own areas of scholarly expertise and networks of scholarly affiliation. I'm speaking of the time after I joined Bernardo as a co-editor of the journal in 1990. So that means for Bernardo, obviously Cyprus and the Levant with extensions to Egypt and the Near East. That meant for me Greece and the Aegean with some extension into Anatolia and into Italy. But the West Mediterranean was another matter altogether. Corsica, Sardinia, Mediterranean, France, the Balearics, Spain, Portugal, Morocco, Algeria, another game altogether. And looking back on the editorial statements that Bernardo and I wrote at regular intervals in the early days of the journal, I see how regularly we pleaded for more submissions from these areas to make it a truly Mediterranean journal. And ultimately, this was an issue we did not fully resolve until 2006, which is when we eventually brought on board as a third co-editor, so that Bernard and I didn't argue so much all the time, a third co-editor with a research focus in the West, namely Peter van Dommelen, who at the time was Bernardo's colleague at Glasgow and is now my colleague at Brown. And his arrival had an immediate impact on broadening the coverage of JMA, as we can see from a couple of graphs. So this one plots the number of articles published in the first decade of JMA's publication. And you can see, just at a glance, that it is dominated by papers concerning Greece and the Balkans, the Levant, Cyprus, but precious few from Spain, let's say, or the West Mediterranean islands, and a number of other areas. This, by the way, shows only what we accepted and published, not what we received. And unfortunately, back then, we didn't keep track of rejected submissions the way we do now. So I can show you that in a much more recent graph for just the past 5 years, or 4.5 years actually, of JMA, in which now, again, as you can readily see, Iberia, the West Mediterranean islands, Italy, all have a much stronger presence. While this is really quite gratifying, there remain pockets of resistance that we've never really been able to crack. Egyptian archaeologists, for instance, clearly prefer to publish in their own very specialized journals for each other. The Journal of Roman Archaeology seems to suck the air out of that field, seems to capture the majority of articles in Roman archaeology. We've just never received very many submissions from the Adriatic. North Africa is pretty much a black hole. Well, so no doubt the details like this are of much more interest to the co-editors than they are to an audience like this one. So let me conclude by with just a few comments about the kind of journal that Bernardo created and has sustained over so many years. It might be appropriate for me to put up this quintessential image of him as I do so. We all know him. There have been a number of hints from a number of speakers from this podium over these 2 days, but I'll just say it out front. Bernardo is a stubborn man. He can be frank, he can be blunt, he's very difficult to talk out of any view that he has adopted and which he wants to defend to the death. Engaging with these qualities of Bernardo has been my life for most of the past 30 years. Because there is, honestly, rarely a day that goes by without some interchange amongst the co-editors. And I have had to become inured to the emails from Bernardo, written all in block capitals, sometimes in red, calling attention to this or that lapse in my duties or in my judgment. So you might well ask, why is the level of communication so intense for a journal that publishes only twice a year? Each issue usually containing only 5 or 6 of these very long articles. And the answer to that is that JMA takes a very hands-on approach with its authors. As I'm sure many of us in this room know full well, with so many archaeological journals now collected under the umbrella of a few very large publishing houses, Taylor and Francis, Springer, Routledge, Cambridge University Press, those kinds of publishers, the experience of the author has become very impersonal. Articles are submitted through the publisher's online portal. Reviewers assigned, perhaps largely automatically, by reference to a database of potential names. Decisions about acceptance based almost entirely on reviews alone. It's not even clear, this has been my experience anyway, that the journal editor has actually read the paper in question. Now, perhaps it has to be so for industrial strength journals like the Journal of Archaeological Science that publishes between 400 and 500 articles a year. But JMA has chosen, or I should say Bernardo has chosen, to be utterly different. So authors submit their manuscripts, not through a portal, but directly to us, the editors. We all read all of the submitted papers. We discuss at length whether to reject without review, or send out for review, or to ask for modifications before review. We have detailed conversations, arguments even, about the most appropriate reviewers based on our own knowledge of the field. One of those reviewers is always a member of the editorial board, carefully chosen for this very purpose. The board serves an active role, in other words, and is not merely honorific, as it is for so many other journals. So authors, at the end of this process, receive feedback on their papers from the 3 co-editors and a member of the editorial board and 2 other external reviewers, and these comments can sometimes run to 9 or 10 pages of comments and suggestions. No doubt this can be very overwhelming, and I know there's a number of JMA authors, there's about 5 of them sitting in the first 3 rows here, so they may have direct knowledge of this. But my point is that for those authors who are willing to work with us, and that is by no means all of them, it encourages very thoroughgoing revisions that result in papers that are both clearer in their arguments and data presentations and closer to achieving JMA's goals of meshing data with theory and speaking to that Mediterranean-wide readership. So finally, I have come to think of JMA as essentially a boutique journal. An analogy to brewing may seem odd, but I think it's apt. If those bigger journals, like Journal of Archaeological Science, to name but one, that crank out hundreds of articles each year are akin to those breweries that produce Budweiser and Heineken, often tasteless and not very distinctive, then JMA is more like a small batch, handcrafted brewery at which enormous efforts are expended to make every bottle as good as it can be and a pleasure to drink. JMA has been Bernardo's baby since its conception, and it has succeeded in, he has succeeded in raising it to fully fledged maturity. And so as we gather here to honor Bernardo's many and diverse achievements in and contributions to archaeology as a whole, I hope you will agree with me that not the least of these is his nurturing of the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology over these past 31s. So thank you and congratulations, Bernardo.
Okay, we reached the high point of the event, obviously. So I'd like to invite Bernard to come up and offer his reflections and comments. And I'd like to suggest that maybe we just also offer a round of applause to Bernard to reflect the fact that I think this has been a wonderful event because so many of us have benefited from his care, attention. I'd actually say love, although occasionally when the caps arrive, you do wonder about that. But his dedication and support of so many people in this room has been extraordinary. And I think we all thank you very much, Bernard.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Not just for your kind comments, but for setting in motion the process that finally has led to this two-day conference in my honor. My reflections have nothing to do with the papers that you've heard over the past 2 days. So all the contributors can relax. I'll explain momentarily what I'm going to do and how I will proceed, as all JMA papers must as well. Starting with Sturt. I've known Sturt since he was a research student at ANU in the 1980s. I still recall his first visit to my basement office in the Fisher Library, something he mentioned in passing, a visit that ultimately led to the first article ever published in JMA, and at nearly 80 pages, it remains one of the longest we ever published. Of course, that was just the beginning of a long and fruitful collaboration. More articles for JMA, a book, again, one of the longest ever published, and capped off by our recent AJA article, which Sturt has also kindly mentioned. I'll be mentioning collaboration frequently in what follows, but felt it appropriate to start with this particular case, which began some 30-odd years ago. I also want to thank Lina Casinidou, another longtime collaborator, who in her role as the director of the ARU offered to host the conference here after the original scheduled meeting at Cornell had to be canceled because of illness, my illness, of course. And I take this opportunity to thank all of the participants, some of whom have paid 2 airfares to take part in this conference. So to all of you, I'm really very grateful. Finally, thanks go to Lindy Crew. Carrie's no longer new, but very proactive director who has co-sponsored the event along with Lina and the ARU. As I thought over what I might say today, it was obvious that one of the most important aspects of my own career, and indeed of virtually every career in archaeology, is the collaborative efforts that I made, that we all make, in field work, in publications, in nurturing and advising students, and in establishing curricula or developing programs of study or research in the departments or institutions in which we work. Moreover, focusing on the collaborative side of things means that I can reflect positively on the work of many colleagues, co-authors, co-editors, and students. I say this because obviously many of you expect to hear me criticizing someone, complaining about the shortcomings of this book or that paper or some field project, whatever. Finally, given my rather peripatetic career in archaeology, I'm aware that at least some of you think I'm American, others that I'm Australian, or even Scottish. In terms of citizenship, I'm all 3. How did all that come about? Having taken a BA in classics from the University of Akron in Ohio, that's USA, in case you didn't know, with a minor in Near Eastern Studies and cuneiform, I opted to do postgraduate study at the University of California at Berkeley in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. And to be honest, studying cuneiform gave me a headache. And in any case, I was more interested in ancient Near Eastern history and culture than philology. And I soon learned that philologists, not unlike archaeologists, were seldom interested in matters beyond their own narrow specializations, be it the Sumerian verb form or pottery. Moreover, and just to make something clear, I have no objection against pottery, and I hope the monograph I produced with Stella indicates that. What I really can't stand is when people write about pottery and recreate entire cultures and scenarios based on pottery alone. This, I think, cannot be done and should not be done. And if that's taken as being like the Lapithians, who didn't like pottery, then I don't like pottery either. Moreover, anyway, philologists, like archaeologists, rarely got beyond their own areas of narrow specialization. Moreover, I was in Berkeley, late 1960s, and along with a host of others, I took a 3-year break from the university, driving a taxi to make a living, protesting against Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, being part of the counterculture, no doubt making a general nuisance of myself. When I returned to the university in 1972, it was a third-year student, postgraduate student, in a new interdepartmental program called Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology, in which I eventually received my PhD. In the States, you're still required to take postgraduate classes. And one of those classes on Cypriot archaeology was taught by a young visiting lecturer named Michal Artzi, who at the time was employed as a postdoc working with Isidore Perlman and Frank Asaro at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory on a large-scale project that was about to make headlines, namely the application of neutron activation analysis in studies on the provenance of Cypriot and Levantine Bronze Age pottery. I was fascinated both by the course that Michal taught as well as the science-based applications to archaeology, and it seems that must have been a defining moment in my career as I maintained both those interests. During the same time, I was thwarted in an early attempt to join a field project on Cyprus in 1974 as a result of the Turkish invasion. And so I first washed up on the island shores in 1982, but it would take another 10 years before I was able to return to Cyprus, to Mitsaro, with a small team to begin the Sydney-Cyprus Survey Project, or SCISP, and more about that momentarily. I should add that Mitsaro was then a small village few had ever heard of, but now has become internationally infamous as the locus where a serial killer dispatched women's and children's bodies, in fact, in that very Kokino-Pizzula lake. With a PhD in hand by the end of the 1970s, I hung on at Berkeley as a temporary lecturer in archaeology for another 5 years, never imagining I would ever leave the place. During that time, another major collaborative effort was in the works, reflecting a developing interest in economic archaeology, specifically in prehistoric production and exchange. Tamara Steck and I organized a session at the 1981 AIA meetings in San Francisco, which ultimately resulted in this co-edited volume. Amongst the other contributors to that volume were Michal Artzi and, not least, John F. Cherry, a collaboration that, as you've just seen, has been crucial for my career and one that has continued to this day. During this same period, 1982 and 83, I led a team of students and volunteers from Berkeley to work in the excavations of a late Bronze, early Iron Age site in Israel, Tel Sharia in the northern Negev. Another team from Macquarie University in Sydney was also involved in that project, and among the team members was a volunteer, Christina Sumner, who eventually became my wife and changed my life. In 1984, I did what was theretofore unthinkable. I pulled up stakes in Berkeley and moved to Sydney with the support of a 3-year postdoctoral grant from the Australian Research Council to work at the site of Pella in Jordan with a team from the University of Sydney. The Sydney years were divided into 2 phases, 1984 to 88 at Sydney Uni and 1992 to 96 at Macquarie Uni. In the crucial intervening years, as you've heard, I held a Fulbright Fellowship at Carey and a 2-year postdoc at Cambridge University, where John and I worked very closely together, and the two of us produced what today would be termed a deliverable. Equally important, this was a time when I traveled around the world, literally, at least twice and often 3 times a year, trying to keep up with multiple projects and commitments and keep myself employed. During these trips, I managed to call upon a number of Mediterranean archaeologists in several countries and convince them to join me on the editorial board of the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, about which you've just heard in some detail. And I think if you look on the third contributor to the first issue of JMA, you'll notice another man sitting in this audience, David Rupp. In any case, work on the journal became overwhelming very quickly, and as John has said, he joined me as co-editor, beginning with Volume 4 in 1990, 1991. This was a collaboration that, in my view at least, has been good for us, good for the journal, and good, we hope, for Mediterranean archaeology. Several other important collaborations developed during the second phase of the Sydney years, in particular as a result of schism. In addition to Michael Given, Lina Casinidou joined the team as archaeometallurgist, and Timothy Gregory, who I think is here somewhere in the room, joined us, took charge of the pottery team. Nathan Meyer, whom some of you will recall from his visit to Berkeley last year as a returning mature age PhD student in Berkeley's anthropology department, also joined us as our computer guru and set up the first integrated GIS and database applications used on a field survey in Cyprus. Annie Evans, an Australian who is also in the office or in the room, also joined us in my answer to a call for a chef who could produce Mediterranean and Asian cuisine in the rather primitive kitchens that served us in the field. Everybody involved still raves about Annie's cooking. And you might all think that a bit odd, but if you'd worked on some of the field projects that I have and eaten the food that I ate, I vowed that nobody who ever worked for me would suffer like I did. In any case, the second phase of the Sydney years resulted in other collaborations, which also reflected some of my developing theoretical interests. Foremost amongst these interests was the archaeology of gender, well represented in a study co-authored with Lynn Meskel, followed by politics and archaeology, first presented in an article by, sorry, that shouldn't be there, co-authored with Sofia Antoniadou. Two further collaborative efforts must be mentioned. The first, Social Approaches to an Industrial Past, reflected my ongoing interest in economic archaeology and archaeometallurgy, and this volume included papers by Lina Casinidou, Steve Shannon, David Killick, and a host of others, but it is one that seems to have become lost in the mists of time, perhaps because it's the most unattractive cover of any book I have ever published. The color, the photograph, the subject matter, I would never buy a book like that. Anyway, the second volume, entitled Archaeology of Landscape, and co-edited with Wendy Ashmore, who sadly has recently passed away, was pointedly theoretical, drawing upon a wide range of research in both the Old and New Worlds related to field survey, regional and peasant studies, phenomenology, amongst others. By 1995, however, the handwriting was on the wall, and it seemed that the Sydney years and my 5-year postdoc at Macquarie University were coming to an end, with little chance of another post in Australia. Having become a citizen in 1992, Australia by then had become home. And for any Aussies in the audience, I still call Australia home. In the midst of a schizophrenic field season, and literally pushed onto the plane by Stuart Swinney and Jim Muley, I traveled to Scotland to interview for a job in archaeological theory at the University of Glasgow. Within a week, I was offered the post and reluctantly accepted. Reluctantly, not because I had anything but optimism about the move to Glasgow, but because by this point, I never wanted to leave Australia behind. A pattern was forming here, as you might recall, at this point that I never wanted to leave Berkeley either. In the end, I managed to convince the University of Glasgow to delay my appointment for 1 year so I could make the most of my last year of postdoctoral research. Take note, those of you who are on your postdocs. In September of 1996, however, I boarded the plane and departed Sydney to begin a new era in Glasgow. I won't elaborate too much on the Glasgow years beyond the collaborations, beginning with a volume that Emma Blake and I co-edited. Like Peter Van Domelen, Emma was part of the original lineup at Cornell, but is currently in the field in Sicily and so could not come to this event. In that volume, Lena and I co-authored a wide-ranging paper entitled Archaeometallurgy in the Mediterranean. Of course, she dealt with the data, I with the theory. Our collaboration continued in a major way on the Troodos Archaeological Environmental Survey project, in which Lena joined me, Michael Given, and Jay Noller, our geomorphologist, as co-directors. Equally important, however, was the collaboration I enjoyed with Peter Van Domelen after he joined Glasgow's Department of Archaeology in 1997. Peter, too, had an unavoidable conflict with the timing of this conference. Peter and I shared students, co-taught courses, ran the MPhil program in Mediterranean archaeology, and along with a group of young postgraduate and young postdoctoral students known as the Material Connections Group, ultimately published in 2010, the volume you see there. Another research student in the department, Ioannis Voskos, had written an excellent MPhil thesis, and together we revised it for publication in the 2008 issue of the AJA. I also want to mention here, although I haven't seen him, another of our MPhil students at Glasgow, Ephthemios Shaftakoulis, now an archaeological officer in charge of publications in the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus. With Peter Van Domelen, more was to come, in particular another co-edited volume. It included 38 papers written by 47 scholars from all regions of the Mediterranean, a few of whom are here today. Once again, John Cherry, Kevin Fisher, and Jenny Webb. And Jenny Webb and I, together with another Glasgow research student, Başak Arda, also collaborated on a SEMA volume cataloging the Cypriot artifacts in Glasgow's Hunterian Museum. And this finally brings me to the Cyprus years. That is from late 2009, when under a great deal of protest, I was formally retired from my position in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Glasgow. Yet again, I balked at leaving my post, and in this case, leaving my third adopted country. Be that as it may, it didn't take long to begin enjoying my retirement, or more correctly, to realize I didn't miss at all the increasing burden of administrative work associated with any academic position. Now, although Jenny Webb and I have never, at least not yet, published anything together, we have worked together in an editorial capacity, in particular on the 2013 volume in honor of the Australian archaeologist James Stewart. I say not yet, as she and I are actually working on a paper, have been for some time now, which will offer a new analysis and synthesis of the Middle Cypriot period. The trick with this collaboration is trying to harmonize Jenny's maximalist views, which you heard yesterday, with my own minimalist opinions. And at this point, I have to tell you, Lena, what a wonderful medium your YouTube is. When we got home last night, Jenny and I had received a long message from Matt Spiegelman, who had watched Jenny's paper, commented on it, but I just want to read one small part of that message. It says, effectively saying that, you know, he agrees with with most of Jenny's points. Happy to see the pins get so much attention, yada, yada, yada. But your model of maritime interaction, and now I'm quoting Matt Spiegelman, your model of maritime interaction looks to me like that of a seasonal or periodic voyaging for largely social symbolic purposes, akin to the Kula Ring or the Cycladic longboats. The scale of travel and boat size seems very compatible with the distance between Cyprus and Anatolia, and I think is compatible with a primarily local village-based economy, i.e. no great amount of agricultural surplus is needed to produce the small amount of goods exchanged. Of course, Jenny still has other ideas, but the point is that thanks to this, thanks Matt if you're still looking, thanks to this access that people have to these talks, I would say that this was not only an interesting suggestion, but one that, I mean, we're not going to start talking about the Kula Ring, but if we did, we'd be covering an area a hell of a lot bigger than the southern western coast of Anatolia, the entire Levant and the Aegean, and so on. So it's an interesting talk, and one that I hope may help us, Jenny and I, to bridge the gap on the paper we're working on. However, by far my most important collaborative effort of the Cyprus years, of course, is the volume co-authored with my wife, Stella Domestica. This was a monumental undertaking, one that was precipitated when Stella walked into my study one day and asked what other kinds of transport containers beyond the Canaanite jar and transport stirrup jar existed in the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. I had no answer, and couldn't even refer her to any single work that dealt with such containers beyond studies of individual types. Thus began what proved to be a 4-year collaborative effort and forced both of us to move well beyond our individual areas of expertise. This book also brought me back to my broader Mediterranean interests, as did another recent paper co-authored with a former Glasgow PhD student and member of the Material Connections group, Anthony Russell. Beyond the paper in progress with Jenny, I have one more collaborative effort underway with Nathan Meyer. We have one paper already in press, which you see here, and are working on another, much more detailed and expanded version. This study, too, is taking me into uncharted waters, namely the early Iron Age. And as is the case with many of the other research projects I've mentioned today, I would never test those waters without close collaboration. In many ways, I feel I'm now moving away from my career-long focus on Cypriot archaeology. I'm running out of things to say. Even so, my own PhD research on Cyprus began in the mid-1970s, so it's no exaggeration to say that one way or another, I've been working on the island for 40 years and living here for the past 10. So in coming toward the end of this rather indulgent exercise, I want to say a few words about prehistoric archaeology on Cyprus. Don't fear. Although I would maintain that the culture-historical paradigm remains prominent in Cypriot archaeology, that statement has to be seen in a wider Mediterranean context. With respect to archaeological method and theory, I have often felt that archaeologists working on Cyprus fell somewhat behind those working in other Mediterranean regions. To be fair, however, I must acknowledge that the papers I see and read from other areas in the Mediterranean, from the Aegean westward to the Balearics and Spain, often as the editor of a journal that focuses on Mediterranean archaeology, those papers tend to be interpretative or theoretical in outlook and are unlikely to be representative of archaeology as a whole in other Mediterranean lands. Moreover, I believe that the widespread concern for the detailed description, classification, and chronological ordering of the Cypriot archaeological record has resulted in an immense and impressive publication record of the island's sites, and its diverse and eclectic material remains. Indeed, it was one of the many things that attracted me to the island when I was still a research student at Berkeley, as did the fact that there was a dearth of theoretical studies that sought to interpret all that material culture. Archaeological theory has made several inroads into Cypriot archaeology over the past 40 years, particularly amongst younger scholars and those trained at least to some extent in the social and physical sciences. In my view, the best way to advance archaeological research, Cypriot or otherwise, and to increase archaeological understanding of material culture is to dissolve the artificial separation between data and method and theory, and instead look to common ground where theory interacts with and is infused by data, thus no longer separating the what from the how of material things. While discussion of such issues still seems somewhat limited in Cypriot archaeology, most younger scholars, I don't mean younger than me, since that would mean everybody in the room, most younger scholars at least are now simply putting such principles into practice rather than preaching about them. We might all do well to take a page from their book. On reflection, then, I feel that I've enjoyed a very privileged archaeological career working on this island, in part the result of my collaborations with Lina Cassianido, in part the support in the form of fieldwork permits and myriad other interventions from several directors of the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus, and in large part from my long-standing association with CARI, with Vathula Mostuki, its perennial administrator and enthusiastic supporter of all things associated with CARI, and with its librarians, in particular Evi Karida and Katharina Mavro-Mikalu, and of course with most of its directors, beginning with Stuart Swinney, always a strong supporter of Skizit. Well, I can't be totally polite for a half hour, if some of you caught that. Concerning Lina, you've already heard of several collaborative efforts, and I would add all the tedious and time-consuming tasks you undertook on behalf of all three of my field projects, Skizit, TASP, and Foradis. I refrain from commenting still on the last. Not least liaising with locals regarding everything from accommodation to field equipment. Concerning the Department of Antiquities, from an initially skeptical Vassos Kariorgis, who eventually came to accept me as someone doing serious work on the late Bronze Age, even if we have never seen eye to eye on most matters. From Vassos through an always supportive and accommodating Sophocles Hadjisavas, and finally to Maria Hadjikosti, I have never experienced anything but cooperation and support from members of the department regarding my field projects, and similarly so regarding most of my publications. So, final words from the podium. I want to reiterate what I said at the outset. Collaborative efforts and widespread support on Cyprus itself have made my career a positive and productive one, and I am deeply grateful to the many colleagues, co-authors, co-editors, and students with whom I've worked over the past 40 years. Special thanks to each and every one of you who attended this conference in my honor, in particular to all the speakers who obviously worked very hard to present papers that might be of interest to me. Not an easy task. Until something like this happens to you, you will never know what a satisfying, humbling, and grateful feeling such an event can generate, and certainly has generated for me. Thank you again.
I think we all deserve a glass of wine to celebrate these 2 days, which have been marvelous. Please, upstairs we have, yes, sorry. Before we go, Lindy would like to say something. Please, come.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate that tomorrow's Kari workshop is a continuation of this celebration, and tomorrow night's party is not just the regular workshop party, it is indeed the party for Bernard as well as the regular party. So I hope as many of you who are able to come along will do to both the day and the evening events.
And before, the speakers, if we stay for 5 minutes, we have some instructions, I think, for later this evening. So the speakers stay. The rest of you, please move and have your glass of wine. We'll be joining you shortly. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here for 2 days straight. I don't think we've had such a full room for such a long time. So thank you very much for being here and sharing with us this event. Thank you.
Please. Okay, this is just a simple procedural request. After the reception, we'll walk, most of us. I think it's a 10-minute walk to the restaurant. If you want to drive, you can drive. That's no problem. When I get to the restaurant, first of all, I will order the orectica, the starters, and the wine. But when you get there, before you even say hello to your neighbor, please sit down, take the menu, and decide what is your choice. It's not like last night. You are going to decide what you want to eat. It's not a meze. It will be orectica, and then a main course, which you can pick and choose whatever you want. But the reason I want you to do this quickly is because we need to get the order in, or it'll be 10:30 or 11 o'clock before we are served. We know this restaurant. They ask us to pre-order. I refused to pre-order because I wanted you to be able to choose what you want to eat. So just remember, when you get there, sit down, make your choices, and get the orders.
What time are we supposed to be there?
The booking is for 8 o'clock. So I mean, I can't imagine we're going to stay here beyond 7:30. So, but yes, the booking is for 8 o'clock in Stella's name. Yes, yeah. Okay, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. I want a photograph of the four of us. Because that's here, so that it says in the rest of the time. Constantino, ανάβεις τα φώτα. Just off the projector, maybe. Bernard?
Come up here, it's going to be photographed.
Like this. The four of us, yeah. Γεωργία, έλα μπροστά.
Maybe I'll come around. Let's mix.
Oh, okay.
We will put center. We put it in the center. In the center.
Nope, wrong angle.
Okay.
Wait, Stella, αλλά και εσύ. Ένα λεπτό. Ένα λεπτό.
Can we go?
Wait. Hold on, let's see.
Isn't there a button?
Yeah. Εντάξει.
Okay.
Άντε, έλα και εσύ, Στέλλα, έλα. Τέλεια.
Okay.
Ωραία, now you can have some wine.
Okay.